Scott, let's go ahead and jump right on into all of this steam when it comes to Bryce Young at the top of the NFL draft. And even though a lot of mock drafters say that Bryce Young is going to go number 1 overall, as far as your board, it looks like you still have CJ Stroud number 1. What do you make of all of this movement, and why are you still sticking with your guns as far as Stroud's concerned?
Yeah, it's been interesting. My last mock draft I did over 10 days ago, so there has been some change since then. I have 2 connections in the Charlotte area. One of them is actually a staff member for one of the colleges out there who has had contact with the scouts. Up until recently, Stroud has been the pick. That's what I've been told from 2 of the people that I have connections with there. And what I'm being told is that the staff very much wants Stroud, and that Fitterer has had recent meetings with both the staff there at Alabama and with Bryce Young himself, and that Fitterer is the one who is kind of sold on Young, came out of a meeting with Nick Saban, and that's where the battle seems to be right now. I've been chasing down to see, and the most recent information I got is that Carolina is set to have a meeting this week and make their final decision and kind of lock in the player that they want. I think the last 2 meetings are with CJ Stroud and Bryce Young, so I would expect something to be finalized here in this week. And, you know, with more information that I get, that possibly could change. But as of right now, I've been told that Stroud's the pick, but there is some last-second things going on with Bryce Young, and I'm told that it comes from the meetings and some of the football stuff that he's kind of displayed with his processing and just the mind that he has to play quarterback.
Scott, if Bryce Young goes number 1, it's likely that the Texans won't take CJ Stroud at number 2, being he has the same agent as Deshaun Watson. So is there any case that you could make for then Anthony Richardson to go number 2 overall?
You know, I have a lot of pushback on that narrative that they're not going to take Stroud just because of the agent and the thing that happened with Deshaun Watson. I think football teams and specifically general managers set their teams up to be as successful as they can and put in the best situation possible. The way footballs work, as far as GMs and agents, you can't just continually hold a grudge every time you were beat out. Now, granted, there was some things happening with the Deshaun Watson case, but I push back that CJ Stroud won't be the number 2 overall pick should Bryce Young go 1. I think Houston has to do what's best for their team. Now, is there a possibility that they have a higher grade on Will Levis? Maybe that's possible, but I don't see Anthony Richardson as a fit there either. So I actually think that if Bryce Young goes 1, I think Stroud will be the number 2 pick.
Where would your surprise level be if Anthony Richardson and or Will Levis somewhere get taken in the top 2 picks?
If either one of those 2 guys got drafted in the top pick, I mean, just when you start looking at the numbers, I mean, Anthony Richardson's at plus 2,000 to go number 1, Will Levis at plus 6,000. I mean, that's off the charts numbers that you would get if you were to place a bet on either of those 2 guys. I just think there's a clear gap at Bryce Young and CJ Stroud as 1 and 2. And, if you start digging into the market even further, you've had a lot of Hendon Hooker hype come up over the last couple of weeks with, reports that some teams actually have him as the number 3 quarterback off the board, not Levis or Richardson. So I would be completely shocked if either one of those guys went within the top 2 picks.
The Cardinals are sitting with the 3rd pick right now. They don't need a quarterback with Kyler Murray for them. So who is a team that you could see potentially being a good fit? And obviously it's, whatever deal that they're able to get done. But what's a team that you think could be the one to trade up into that 3rd spot?
So in my most recent mock draft, I had Tennessee. I played with Tennessee kind of moving up there to that 3rd spot. I think wholeheartedly the 2 teams that I think would be moving up is going to be either the Colts or Tennessee. Tennessee is on the last year with Ryan Tannehill. They've not been impressed with what they've gotten out of Malik Willis, and early returns even in the offseason aren't good with that. So I think there's an outside chance. It's really going to be up to the Cardinals and what deal they get and how willing they are to move down. And specifically for the Colts, I think the Colts are kind of in no man's land. If 4 quarterbacks were to come off the board within those top 4 picks, the Colts would be sitting there kind of looking at, at the back end and getting what's left over. I think the Colts are going to make a decision as to whether or not they want Levis or Richardson. And based upon that decision, they don't have much that they would have to give up to move up one spot. That also gives the Cardinals, they'll be able to get a little bit of assets back in return with the trade and wouldn't have to move down that far. So they would possibly be able to trade back and still draft Will Anderson if Will Anderson's the player that they want. So I think those are the two teams with Indianapolis and Tennessee that I kind of lean towards the most in moving up to that 3 spot and drafting a quarterback.
First defensive player taken overall. There is a case to be made for Will Anderson and Jalen Carter. What say you?
I think it's going to be Will Anderson. A lot of people, specifically scouts, tend to value Jalen Carter a little bit more. It's few and far between as far as defensive tackles that are really able to push the pocket and penetrate and cause that inside pressure and force quarterbacks outside of the pocket. You've got a guy in Jalen Carter that's able to do that. The knock on him outside of the off the field issues has been his consistency has been a little bit off. He takes plays off sometimes and things of that nature. But I think Will Anderson is just a clean prospect as far as this draft goes. So I would tend to favor him.
How about the 2 cornerbacks that are projected to go early in the first round? Christian Gonzalez, then you have Witherspoon from Illinois. Where do you see them falling?
So that's been a topic of discussion on our own podcast. We're kind of split. I think Devin Witherspoon and Christian Gonzalez are 1A and 1B. My co-hosts have been on Devin Witherspoon going ahead of Christian Gonzalez, but I went back and looked at the last 10 years of cornerbacks. And the first cornerback to come off the board in the last 10 drafts, only one time has it been a non-underclassman. So underclassmen, early declares, always come off the board first. The one time it didn't happen in the last 10 years was in 2015 when Trey Waynes was drafted as the first cornerback off the board as a senior. Also, when you start looking into things, you did have Devin Witherspoon recently run a 40 in a private workout that he put on outside of Illinois' pro day. He ran a 4.42 and a 4.46. So people are going to be comfortable with where he ran, but his athletic profile is still incomplete because he has not tested and done all the other things that you would look for. With those trends that GMs tend to draft with the top cornerback, especially ones that are going to go in the top 10, you're looking for an athletic profile as far as their relative athletic scores generally been 8.35 or over. When you start talking about Christian Gonzalez, he's measuring out at a 9.96. So he's got elite athleticism. And I think overall, with the size and some other things that he has going for him, I tend to lean a little bit more towards Christian Gonzalez being the first cornerback off the board. That's not to knock anything with Devin Witherspoon. I definitely think he's a 1B, but, he's a little bit smaller prospect, 4-year player. He's like a 1-star recruit going out of high school. I don't hold that against him, but I think when GMs start looking at these players as prospects, you have a guy in Christian Gonzalez that was, at the top, and he's going through the whole process as one of the top elite cornerbacks.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit of Bijan Robinson here, and sort of a 2-parter, because looking at your mock draft, you got him going 8 overall to the Atlanta Falcons. First off, that is a good bit higher than a lot of other projections I've seen. When you see that are different than others, it's one of those moments. Okay, I am confident in what I have here, so that's going to be interesting. Or is it something where you sort of go back and reevaluate, but you're still comfortable with what you have? But then also too, Robinson being number 8 overall, playing running back, yeah, he's an exceptional talent. But do you also think that there's a little bit of pushback by the league to draft a running back that high?
I think there is a little bit of pushback, but the issue that you're having as far as Bijan Robinson as a talent and where teams are basically looking at him, it's hard to match up the need for a running back there in that top half of the draft. Specifically, the way I land on Atlanta is you start looking at their history, and 2 years ago, they drafted a tight end in the top 4. In Kyle Pitts. So you start throwing the positional value out of the window a little bit with some of what Atlanta has done. And Atlanta's the one team that I landed on. Arthur Smith, you've seen him build and develop an offense around Derrick Henry when he was in Tennessee. You've got a GM there that is willing to go outside of the norms of positional value of what other GMs think. And I landed on Atlanta there because I think they're going to be run heavy. You start looking at them going at quarterback with Desmond Ridder this year and Taylor Heineke, and I think they're going to want to put as many tools as they can around those players. And I think Bijan Robinson's a guy that they can lean on specifically in a rushing attack to do that. Will they draft him there at 8? 8 might be a little bit high, but Atlanta's also in a position where they could maybe move down a few picks and go ahead and make that. So if they can get some assets back, another little bit of stuff to a late round draft pick, or something in the 3rd round, maybe 4th round, pick up an extra pick, move down, draft Bijan Robinson, I think it's a possibility.
Scott, how would you kind of classify this year's wide receiver group? I mean, Quentin Johnson, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Jalen Hyatt. Is this a solid wide receiver draft class? Is it fairly down from years past? What do you think?
I actually think it's down a little bit. In my mock draft, if I could go back and change one pick from my most recent one, and in my next mock draft, he'll definitely be higher. You start looking at Jackson Smith and Jigba. And specifically when you start looking at the guys and getting the information out of Ohio State, and you look at the players that, just recently got drafted, Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, those guys. And look, Jackson Smith and Jigba, from the coaches at Ohio State, they rate Jackson Smith and Jigba higher than those 2 guys that you just saw drafted this past year that performed well on the NFL level. So I think you have to start moving him up. I believe his over-under came out around like 12.5. I think there's definitely, you can start looking at him there around Tennessee at 11. I think he's definitely a possibility for Houston at 12. So you have some teams there. And if those guys and Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave went in that range, and the Ohio State coaches and other scouts around the league tend to value Jackson Smith and Jigba a little bit more, I think he's a guy that's going to rise and go within that range. The rest of the group that you're sitting there in the 1st round, all these guys kind of have, some other issues. Like when you start talking about Addison, he's a little bit undersized. I think he weighed in around 173 or 178 pounds, somewhere in that range. Quentin Johnson wasn't quite as big as they expected him to. You look at the tape, he doesn't attack the ball quite, high pointed the way you would want to out of a big receiver. He's had some drops. So Zay Flowers is probably the guy of the 1st round receivers that's starting to rise a little bit late in this process. So I think you're going to have those 4 guys are going to be the ones that you can kind of pencil in for the 1st round.
Yeah, looking at the odds there, Smith and Jigba minus 300 to be the first wide receiver drafted. Zay Flowers at 4-1, Jordan Addison at 8-1. It also feels like this wide receiver class is such to where there aren't necessarily a lot to choose from in terms of 1st round talent. So would that force teams, especially higher up, to take Smith and Jigba, given that they may not see another wide receiver who's serviceable for some time?
Yeah, I think when you start looking at specifically these 4, I don't have another wide receiver ranked in my top 50. So I just think these 4 are locked in. And if you don't get one here in the 1st, it's probably going to be late 2nd until you start kind of considering some of these guys. Jalen Hyatt throughout the draft process is kind of falling off. You've got Kayshon Boutte sitting there next, and he's had a lot of off the field issues. He's dismissed at LSU. He performed very poorly throughout the pre-draft process and workouts. So there's a lot of question marks, and Josh Downs is a solid prospect, but he's a little bit undersized as well. So the other issue that you have is, aside from maybe Jackson Smith and Jigba and Quentin Johnson, a lot of these guys project specifically as either a slot or a deep threat. So you don't have that prototypical alpha wide receiver that you can kind of depend on and project some of these guys to.